Thank you.
With that, we end the first talk in our conference, and what a talk. Thank you. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the second talk in the Understanding 3 conference. It's my pleasure and privilege to welcome Michael P. Lynch to be our keynote speaker for the event. Mr. Lynch is a Board of Trustees Distinguished Professor of Philosophy and a Director of the Humanities Institute at the University of Connecticut. And before giving him the floor, I should say that when I first started thinking about writing a PhD on understanding when I was a grad student at UVA, one of Michael's preprints on coming to understand was incredibly helpful. And we chatted via email a bit, and it was just an incredible step up for me to be able to move on from there. So Michael, thank you for that. And without further ado, please take it away.
Well, thank you for that very generous introduction. And I'm flattered to be here and honored to be here to talk to you about understanding. The title of my talk is a little bit different than what I suggested, but it's the same talk, but a better title, I think: Political Understanding and Misunderstanding. I want to begin by discussing an ideal. It's actually a political ideal, one inspired by Dewey, but actually resonant with many conceptions of democracy. And that's the idea that democracies should be spaces of reasons. Democracies strive, according to this ideal, or should strive to settle disagreements by appeal to reasons or practices which promote them, as opposed to power or manipulation. That's the ideal. Now, that ideal doesn't really require that citizens politically understand one another, whatever that means. It doesn't require that, nor should having any such understanding of each other, whatever that means, is that going to be sufficient for achieving the ideal of democracy as a space of reasons? Nonetheless, it seems to me fairly intuitive, and this is my sort of premise, that not politically understanding one another could undermine the realization of the ideal of democracy as a space of reasons, and that more understanding in some way facilitates its achievement. Doesn't entail it, but it does hopefully in the right conditions facilitate its achievement of that ideal. So I want to ask 3 questions today. First, what is political understanding? Can we make sense of that? And is it really a type of understanding as epistemologists think of it? The answer to that is, in my view, yes. What sort of toxic attitudes might interfere with such understanding? And how might that prove to be a problem for democracy? So first, I want to make a distinction that Andre alluded to between understanding and coming to understand. So in order to talk about, in other words, about political understanding and see whether it's a type of understanding, I need to explain to you what I think understanding is. And here, my analysis here, I think, begins with a thought that lots of philosophers have had, that understanding as a distinctive state, whether it's a kind of knowledge or not, is directed at whys and hows, as is sometimes put, the structure of the whole subject towards which it is directed. And on that basis, you can give a kind of functional definition or characterization of understanding that at least serves, if not to explicate the meaning of the term, but can serve as a way of fixing the reference of what you're talking about when you're talking about the mental state of understanding. I'm going to claim that a state of some agent plays the understanding role with regard to some subject when its content first concerns dependency relations between proposition, events, states of affairs relevant to the subject. It is conducive to the agent's ability to offer justified explanations of the relevant subject. It disposes the agent to make further justified inferences, both factual and counterfactual, about the subject. So if you understand, for example, how to get to Larissa from wherever you're standing at the moment, then that means that you understand certain relations of, dependency on geographical dependency and causal relationships. You're about location. You're also going to be able to, presumably, to the degree that you understand, you're going to be able to at least be in a better position to offer some explanations for why that's a route to Larissa, to people who inquire. And you're going to presumably be able to make certain justified inferences, namely which direction to travel, both factual and actually counterfactual. So that's how I understand understanding. And I'm trying to remain reasonably neutral here, not completely neutral, obviously, between different accounts. I think that characterization of the state that I gave functionally is importantly different.
No.
And I think this is somewhat analogous. Crucially, understanding the state is distinct from, I'm going to claim, coming to understand, that is the process, because one reason to think they're distinct is because one understands is in the state, only one first comes to understand. That seems to me fairly obvious, that you can be understanding only if you first come to understand. You can believe only if you first come to have that belief. Similar with lots of mental states. Their causal history is obviously, because of the nature of causation, predates the actual occurrence of the state. So coming to understand is a mental act in the same way that reflecting or deciding are mental acts. They are activities that your mind engages in. They take effort and increase the. More controversially, I've claimed that the mental act that we talk about in the understanding literature all the time of grasping is best understood as an element of the process of coming to understand. When we talk about grasping, I've argued elsewhere, we're really talking about the process of coming to understand. We can still talk about grasping when we talk about the state of understanding, but what we're alluding there is implicitly the fact that we've undergone this process and we've come to, as the metaphor suggests, reached out and grasped the dependency relations in question. And I've argued more controversially that this is a kind of creative act, this coming to understand or grasping. I'm only going to briefly mention, this is a whole talk in itself. I'm not going to, in this talk, I'm going to circle back to the point about creativity. So I do want to actually say a little bit about it. Creative acts can be understood as acts that are new or novel to the subject, but not necessarily historically. In fact, most of the creative things that you or any of us here do in our lives are probably, alas, not going to be historically creative. We may come to, for example, understand or grasp a certain form of art or a theory that many other people have come to understand before. But nonetheless, coming to understand can still be new or novel to us the first time that it happens to us. Creative acts are valuable to the subject's cognitive workspace. They move things forward on their conceptual field. They're typically the result of cognitive effort, distinctive of what I would claim we'd best call, in a Kantian tone of voice, the synthetic imagination. And they're often, but not necessarily, accompanied by some sort of distinct phenomenal experience. This is, we might think, typified by a kind of coming to understand that is, we sometimes call insight, where people have a sort of aha moment. But I'm definitely not claiming that coming to understand requires anything like that. It may not have any phenomenal experience because it may happen beneath the level of conceptual consciousness, although that would be, I think it's fairly rare for that to happen. But it may also just be accompanied by a feeling of satisfaction that you've reached a goal. You've actually grasped, put your mental hands around the mental object in question. So the hypothesis that I'm going to assume here is that coming to understand involves actively grasping certain rational and causal dependency relations, where grasping is a connotative state of mind, both directed and active, but not always open to direct conscious access, with features associated with a creative mental act. All right? So that's what I'm going to claim. Now let's talk about different kinds of understanding. So one type of understanding, which really I don't have a great name for, is the kind of understanding that we often talk about in the understanding literature, which I'll call here theoretical understanding or T understanding. T understanding is understanding why or how an event happens, or why or how a theory is explanatory or fecund by understanding the relevant causal or rational dependency relations between the events or the elements of a theory. Okay, so I'll call that theoretical understanding. I'm going to contrast that to what I'll call personal understanding. Now, understanding persons has started to receive more of attention in the literature in epistemology, but it's when we talk about understanding persons, often the people that we might find working on it, and certainly on political understanding, are theorists in somewhat different fields that who could benefit from epistemological intervention, I think, but we could benefit from reading these political scientists and sociologists as well. In any event, I'm going to take it that understanding persons, when one understands another human being, a person, one understands someone to the extent that one grasps why and how they do what they do, and how they see the world. That's a sort of gloss. To unpack that, what I mean is that understanding persons is a complex state of understanding, and coming to understand persons is quite a difficult act and creative act if done well, or done at all. And it's complex because it has three subcomponents. First, all of which are also degree theoretic. So obviously I'm giving you a degree theoretic characterization, and I'm giving it in terms of three components, each of which comes in degrees. So one grasps, the first component is actually a component that is comprised of a kind of theoretical understanding. That is, one understands in part when one grasps, that is a human being, when one grasps to some degree the causal relations between their experiences, their behaviors, their emotions, and their beliefs. One gets to, so to speak, how these fit together, the components of their psychology and their behavior, how they tick, as is sometimes put in English. And this, of course, can be indexed to a time. I could have understood you better 5 years ago than today, or vice versa. Now, this first element of understanding persons should seem familiar. It's basically an application of theoretical understanding. And to the degree that one grasps somebody only in this sense, to that degree, you're sort of having some understanding of the person, but it's what we might call clinical understanding. Clinical. It's a kind of understanding that we might, that a doctor might come to understand a patient. But one understands a person much more to the degree that one grasps to some degree their point of view. This is my gloss on something that Stephen Grimm has said. What reasons they might give for believing and doing what they do. So we grasp their reasons, the ones that they would give, at least would be disposed to give in the right situation. But I think that is not so these first two elements of understanding persons are important, but they're certainly not the only elements. Another element is grasping to some degree how their actions and beliefs depend on their self-identity. Whether the particular person would give these characterization themselves is a different question. We're not always transparent to ourselves. But we understand another person, I think, most fundamentally, when we understand the kind of person they aspire to be, what they identify with, and what matters to them. Understanding of this degree, of this kind, is therefore akin to grasping a narrative. This element of understanding persons, the complex, is akin to grasping a narrative, to grasping how this person sees themselves in a particular plot, sees themselves as pursuing particular goals, as a kind of character. So what is political understanding then? Well, to politically understand a person is to grasp to some degree both their political point of view and how their political actions and convictions depend on their political self-identity. That is, the kind of political groups they aspire to be part of, the political ideals with which they identify, and what policies and political actions matter to them. So we grasp the reasons that they might give, but we also grasp their political self-identity. Again, we may only do this partially, and therefore we typically only partially, or even if we're lucky enough to politically understand anyone at all, we're going to be politically understand them probably only partially. And this is done in part by grasping political reasons these political self-identities generate, and the dependency or lack thereof between their actions on those reasons. So in other words, we could grasp somebody's political self-identity, but also understand that they're not living up to their aspirational political self. They want to be the kind of person that combats climate change, that is working to help keep the planet greener, but they just don't seem to live up to it that much. Understanding that is also understanding them politically. Perhaps, if you're interested, we could also talk about what it is to politically understand a group. I'm talking about politically understanding a person who is a member of a political group, possibly, or is aspirationally part of that group. But we could also understand politically understanding groups themselves, but that's a different question. So what is it to lack political understanding? Well, I think we lack political understanding of persons to the degree we don't grasp their point of view and political self-identities. We don't grasp either their political reasons, and we don't grasp their aspirational political selves, their ideals, as it were, their plot, their narrative. And that can happen for several reasons. First, we might not grasp somebody's political point of view because it's incoherent, or it's at least opaque to us. We just don't understand what the reasons, and we don't understand how the kind of person that they want to be. Or we find that vision of them, of political membership, somehow just incoherent or perhaps even repugnant. But we can also lack political understanding, by lacking certain experiences that others have. This can be overcome to some degree via inference and an understanding of other elements of their point of view. So sometimes when you lack experience of another group that you are interacting with politically you lack those experiences. Because, for example, you're of a different race or a different gender, different sexual orientation, you might be able to get some way to understanding them politically by using inference and explanatory hypotheses, drawing on common ground, for example, that you might share with the group. But it also may be that the experiences we lack would be transformative. That is, that the experiences that are relevant to politically understanding them are ones that, were we to have them, they would radically change our current standpoint in ways that we don't currently understand. If that's the case, then there could be some kinds of political understanding that are forever out of our reach. But I'm not really interested in that today. What I'm interested in the idea of political misunderstanding. That is, we can also misunderstand people politically. And by the way, I think in general in the understanding literature, there's not enough focus on misunderstanding. Obviously, when we use understanding in the semantic sense, and we're talking philosophy of language, misunderstanding is a crucial part of that story. But I think here it's important to remember, at least when talking about personal or political understanding, it's definitely the case we can misunderstand people. That is, we can lack understanding while believing that we have it. That's what I define as misunderstanding a person or a person politically. We lack understanding, perhaps for the reasons I gave a moment ago, but we believe we have it. To be in such a state is to be in a state that is phenomenologically indistinguishable, at least for the moment, to the agent from understanding itself, but which has not been preceded by the process of coming to understand. So in other words, I think you can be in a state that phenomenologically seems to you just like your understanding, but you haven't actually come to understand. You haven't gone through that creative like process of grasping for some reason or another. And I want to, in the time remaining, I want to briefly talk about one attitude that we can have towards our own mental states, including our states of understanding or putative states of understanding, that is toxic for our political understanding. An attitude is toxic for understanding of any sort when it reliably interferes with an agent's ability to come to understand some subject or person. And that, I think, is going to be true for whether we're talking theoretical understanding or political understanding. Well, here's the attitude that I think is particularly relevant here. What I've called, and other people call, intellectual arrogance. I sometimes call epistemic arrogance. Basically, the epistemically arrogant person, the person who's suffering from epistemic arrogance, thinks and acts like, as the graphic shows, that they know best, that no one in particular can really teach them anything. More precisely, this kind of arrogance is a defensive commitment to the epistemic unimprovability of one's worldview by the evidence or experience of others. And here I'm drawing on some work by Tanazzini and Baddeley, as well as some work by myself. Typically, I think epistemic arrogance is caused not by ignorance itself. An epistemically arrogant person can actually know quite a bit. That is, a know-it-all might actually logically know it all. But their epistemic arrogance is caused by not their ignorance, therefore, but by their socially reinforced fear of it. And not by confidence, but by our socially reinforced desire for it. So we don't want to confuse epistemic arrogance with either ignorance or confidence. It's different from both of those. We want confidence, and we're socially reinforced to aim at it, to be seen as the person that knows, that doesn't make mistakes. And we're also very fearful at the same time of being perceived as a person that makes mistakes. So that fear and that desire can cause in someone this state of epistemic arrogance, a state which is fundamentally a kind of distorted relationship to truth. When you're epistemically arrogant, you think that no one can teach you anything. You're committed to the superiority of your view, not because it reflects the world, so to speak, how it is, the truth, but because it reflects your self-regard. Epistemic arrogance at its core is a conflation of ego and truth. You're thinking that what you're believing is true because it's true, but actually you have this confidence in your beliefs because of your ego, this defensiveness about your ego. And at its logical limit, the epically epistemically arrogant, like my former president, sadly now, well, happily now former president Donald Trump, might be an example of this. Somebody who is so arrogant epistemically that they come to think that something is true just because they believe it. Their beliefs are true just because they believe it, which is incoherent, but it's not a tenable notion of truth. But as my example shows, epistemic arrogance is, although not exclusively, is typically an affliction of the powerful, the privileged, or those who perceive or aspire to be so. Now, in this book, Know-It-All Society, I claim that an important kind of epistemic arrogance is partisan epistemic arrogance, being intellectually arrogant about your world, not because it is being intellectually arrogant about your world, because it is yours, and because it's you're part of a particular group. That is, it's the attitude that we know and they don't. So it's your membership in a particular group that your membership with plays a part in your self-identity. In other words, you think of yourself as aspiring to be this kind of person that is part of this group. And once you have that sort of conception of self-identity, you can, if conditions are right, fall into a kind of partisan epistemic arrogance that basically consists in the idea that you know and others don't. Sorry. All right, there we go. So this generally supports a sort of politics of not just us versus them, but of us over them. And there's a lot to be said here. I'm sort of moving through it very quickly. But it's pretty obviously involved in nationalism, racism, sexism. For example, a racist is often unwilling to take seriously non-whites as credible, and so forth. So I realize I'm moving quickly. I realize that I just want to keep the time in mind. But I should also note that partisan epistemic arrogance is the sort of thing that when you're suffering from it, it's very difficult to understand, like arrogance in general, that you are. That's one of the things that makes arrogance so disturbing. We can spot it easily in others. You can spot it in others. Very difficult to spot in yourself. And that's true for partisan epistemic arrogance as well. Very difficult sometimes to tell whether you're endorsing a view or committing to a view or embracing a conviction because of its probative force, its evidence that you have for the conviction, or whether you've adopted it because you have a view that your side adopts it and your side is always right. It goes for me and all of us here, sadly. Now, I think arrogance pretty obviously interferes with being able to come to understand people politically, because it can cause us not to listen or uptake or absorb others' testimony about their experience. But it can also cause someone to believe that they understand a political self-identity that they don't or can't understand. A paradigmatic example of this I've given in other publications is mansplaining. The mansplainer is the person the man who will often explain what it's like to experience life as a woman to a woman, or implicitly assume that they understand that. And that obviously is a barrier to political understanding. It leads to clear misunderstanding people politically. That person the mansplainer lacks political understanding of other people, particularly women and people of a different gender, partly because of their epistemic arrogance that they're exemplifying. And this is particularly toxic, I think, when members of one group think that they understand members of another group, those people, because, so some racist politicians put it in the United States, because they assume that their own point of view represents, so to speak, the view from everywhere. So when, for example, white people in my own country think that they assume think that they understand politically non-white people, that's sometimes because they're thinking that their own view, that the view of white people, represents the views of everyone. So, for example, a white person might say, well, I don't think that joke was racially offensive. I didn't find it racially offensive. Implicitly saying, in other words, no one should find it racially offensive, because they're assuming that their own point of view, their own reasons, and their own self-identity is paradigmatic of human self-identity and political reasons, or a political point of view. So that seems particularly problematic. Misunderstanding generated by arrogance seems particularly problematic, I think, for democracy. And this is something that others have noticed. So John Dewey, to return to him, with whom I started, says in one of his later essays, merely legal guarantees of the civil liberties of free belief, free expression, free assembly are of little avail if in daily life, freedom of communication, the give and take of ideas, facts, experiences, for example, is choked by mutual suspicion, by abuse, by fear and hatred. I take Dewey here to be suggesting that some of the attitudes that he mentions, to which I would add epistemic arrogance, are toxic for political understanding, and therefore toxic for a healthy public discourse, toxic, therefore, for achieving the ideal of democracy as a space of reasons. Now, I want you to notice that this quote comes from an essay that's entitled Creative Democracy, the Task Before Us. And that's, I think, really a good place by which to wrap up with a speculative conclusion. What I've said so far is that political understanding is a type of understanding in its proper sense, as we understand in epistemology. And it involves grasping the dependency of others' actions and convictions on their political self-identities, their narratives, and their points of view. I've also said that arrogance can be toxic to political understanding by interfering with our ability to come to understand, by interfering with a process. A process I said shared elements with creative processes of coming to understand or grasping another's political self-identity. So I've talked about what political understanding is, and I've said that arrogance can be toxic to it by interfering with the process that is causally required for reaching the state of political understanding. What that suggests to me, and this is the speculative conclusion, is that the realization of democratic ideals like the democratic space of reasons is facilitated by, first, recognizing that political understanding requires, as Dewey would have said, creative acts and effort on the parts of citizens. And that is what makes, of course, as Dewey argues in several places, what makes democracy so, the ideals of democracy, like the ideal of democracy as a space of reason, which is facilitated by political understanding, what makes it so difficult to achieve, in part because to achieve it, we're going to be best going to be able to achieve it if we can engage in the sort of creative acts of coming to understand each other politically. Creative acts are very difficult. They require the right sort of conditions. And thus, to realize these democratic ideals, Dewey, I think, understood more than most that we need to provide the institutional support for that sort of creativity, the creativity involved in politically understanding another, to flourish. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much to Professor Lynch. And I believe that what we see is the cover of a book. So,
it's actually it's a graphic from a project that we are doing at the University of Connecticut called The Future of Truth. A little advertising for me for that project, which you can learn about on the Institute's website. But here, I'll take the slides down right now.
That's fantastic, and very much looking forward to what the future of truth is. So thank you so much to Professor Lynch, and I'm sure everyone's joining me in using the applause button. Let's have a first row of questions. If you'd like to raise your hand or make yourselves known in chat, and we already have two questions. First, we have Dr. Sultanescu. Olivia, please go ahead.
Thank you for the talk. My question concerns the relationship between the characterization of personal understanding that you offered at the beginning of the talk and the diagnosis of a person as epistemically arrogant, which you fleshed out in the second part. So when we engage in the kind of personal understanding that you described, it's important, you said, that we appreciate the reasons that the person might have for acting and believing in the way in which she does. And my question is whether the kind of diagnosis or the kind of ascription of epistemic arrogance that we might make to someone in a particular context instantiates or exhibits personal understanding. And here's a source of doubt that it might not. You said that the person who's epistemically arrogant has a distorted relationship with truth, and that sounds right to me. And you said that she might take her beliefs to be true because they're hers, and that also sounds right to me. But the trouble is that that doesn't seem to capture the subject's own perspective, because even the most epistemically arrogant person is going to offer reasons for her beliefs, reasons that don't consist just in saying, these beliefs are true because they're mine. And so to what extent, when we think of someone as epistemically arrogant, are we genuinely understanding them as persons? Thank you.
That's a great question, and one close to all of our psychological homes, I guess, because, well, of course, I was about to say that sometimes in philosophy we encounter arrogant people, but of course none of us here have ever had that experience. But because none of us here, except me, I wrote a book on arrogance because, you know, you're told to write about what you know. So I wrote about that. Jokes aside, I think your question is really good. There is this, you're right, that when we come to understand politically someone who is arrogant, we're going to understand that person to a greater degree, to the degree to which we understand what I call their point of view. That is their reasons why they have, their understanding of their own reasons. And an arrogant person is going to have reasons, or so they think, because arrogance is the sort of thing that, as I said, is not transparent to ourselves. When we are being arrogant, we don't realize that we're being. What I want to say about that is we really best understand an arrogant person when, A, we understand that they're arrogant, right? But we also understand why they think what they're saying is not a result of their arrogance. And I think this can happen where we say, so in other words, understanding that a person, sort of ascribing arrogance to someone correctly, epistemic arrogance or a partisan arrogance to a group correctly. Also, if you're going to understand that group politically, you're going to have to still be able to hold the thought that, well, they're being epistemically arrogant, but they don't realize that they are. You know, now, if you get to that point, you're doing really well, right? It's difficult to get to that point with people, right? Because often, I think you're right that to ascribe arrogance, and this is the deep point that I think you're making, and I hope that I'm responding to it. What I'm taking away is you're saying that, look, the ascription of arrogance to others can itself perhaps be toxic to our understanding, right? That's the point you're trying to make. Right? Or you did make beautifully, but I am just now understanding. So that seems right to me. I want to agree with that. That was a long-winded way of just saying, understanding now what you were saying, and saying that, yes, you're right. Ascriptions of arrogance can themselves be barriers to political understanding. And that's a real takeaway point that I'll keep. Thank you very much. So I don't think that is, you know, I hope that's, did that help in any way?
Yeah, it does. I guess this indicates that personal understanding and political understanding might sometimes pull in different directions, and in order to engage politically with others in the right way, we might need to maybe not view them as people that demand the sort of understanding that ordinary agents do. I'm not sure what you'd like to say about that, but this was very helpful. Yes, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. No, I see the tension that you're talking about, and I'm going to have to think about that more.
Right, thanks so much, Olivia, for the question, Michael, for answering. We have a new question from Professor Ilikowski. Petri, please go ahead.
Thank you for the talk. I have a question of clarification and then question. So question of clarification, when you describe what we understand, when we politically understand others, you were describing their aspirations, identity, and so on. Do you also include their beliefs about how society works, what motivates people, and so on? So this is a clarificatory question. Then question about these toxic attitudes. I like the idea, but I was wondering whether there are others. Especially I'm thinking about kind of epistemic distrust, in a sense that you are suspicious of everything what members of other group are saying, and this can go very bad. So would you consider this also kind of toxic attitude?
Yes. Yes, that's a great, both of those are really helpful. In fact, Dewey seems to be straightforwardly thinking about epistemic distrust in the quote that I mentioned, among other things. Hatred was another attitude, right? That seems pretty obviously toxic. But epistemic distrust, as we're seeing, you know, of course, with the COVID pandemic in a lot of countries, certainly mine, a lot of epistemic distrust going around, and it's not conducive to political understanding, that's for sure. So I think that's right. So I just picked out arrogance because it's one attitude I've thought more about, and so I took it as an example, but it's certainly not the only example. Then as far as your other question, yes, understanding the dependency relation between other people's political beliefs and their political actions is clearly an element of political understanding. One of the things that I went by very quickly, but I want to emphasize here is that political understanding is, first of all, as I said, is a matter of degree. And secondly, it has three components, each of which is a matter of degree. The first component is this sort of what I called is an element of what we might call theoretical understanding. That's when we understand their beliefs and why their actions are based on their beliefs. And that is also a type of understanding we might have of somebody politically or otherwise, just a personal understanding that we might have in a clinical way, right? The sociologist that's studying a group of political group can understand someone to some degree, them politically to some degree, just by understanding taking a survey, finding out what they say they believe, and then looking at what they do and understanding the relationship between those, right? Sometimes the group will do what they say they believe, and sometimes they won't. And the sociologist gets more information about that and begins to come up with an explanation. So that's a component of personal understanding, and therefore a component of political understanding. But it's not the only component. It involves the other two are the one we were just talking about a moment ago, grasping their reasons, their point of view. That is why they have why they think they have the reasons that they have. And then also grasping what I call their self-identity. I hope that was helpful.
All right, thanks so much for the question, Debbie, and Michael for answering. I think I might just insert a question of my own, and please correct me if I'm on the wrong track here, and this might be sort of a wild goose chase. I might have misunderstood what you're saying, so just apologies in advance, but here it goes. I'm interested in the connection, in the causal connection between being epistemically arrogant and politically misunderstanding others, right? So I could see how being epistemically arrogant might perhaps hinder or impair the ability to see mutual identities co-constructed in dialogue or something like that. But I guess you started by talking about Stephen Grimm and others, and about this idea of narrative, right? Of understanding as a person as a narrative. And
right.
I was wondering how being arrogant, for instance, might in any way hinder or impair or alter or one's narrative abilities. Is that something that I don't know? Is that something that you've considered, or?
Yes. So I've been thinking. So the reason I brought up narrative, you're right. I was thinking of these other accounts, but I was also just thinking about my own views about what political self-identity involves. Political self-identity on my account involves having an aspirational political self. You see yourself as aspirationally part of a particular group, as having certain convictions that are partly constitutive of that membership in that group. You may not live up to that. You may not, in fact, be included in the group. But your political self-identity is in that sense, part of your political aspirational self. And that's why your political self-identity or that is your political convictions and your political views are so difficult to give up, because to give them up is to give up the kind of person you aspire to be. And that means that when we're engaged in certain types of reasoning about politics, we often are engaged in what Diane Kahan, the cognitive psychologist at Yale, calls identity protective reasoning. We overlook various evidence, we push away counter evidence, but we also, if we're arrogant, can fall into misunderstanding, if I'm getting the gist of your question, other people's and our own narrative, actually. First of all, we'll take ourselves as being, if we're arrogant, the sort of the center of every story, right? And so that seeing yourself as the center, seeing your story as being able to be explicable and be the kind of story that others are playing a part in, and maybe minor parts, that can prevent you from really grasping the other as a fully political person. So yeah, I think it interferes with our ability to understand narratives. I mean, this also just is true for literature, for example, where the metaphor comes from. When we understand, you think about or to switch an example, to think about theater. I used to, when I was younger, I used to do some acting and was involved in theater professionally. And one of the rules of sort of acting or even directing or engaging with theater at all is that you're supposed to try to come to the part without too much imposing yourself, right? You need to let we have all these metaphors for it. Let the part speak to you, right? In other words, not impose your own narrative, right? Unless the director says that's what they want. But generally, you're trying to figure out how Macbeth ticks. What makes him tick? What's his political self-identity? And not impose one that you have yourself. I think that goes for political understanding too. I hope that was helpful.
It was. Thank you so much. And we have a new question from Professor Domingo. Please go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much for your very thorough and very illuminating talk. This is not exactly my field, so I followed what you presented with very much interest. So I take it that the opposite of epistemic arrogance could be a sort of epistemic humbleness. And we know from, I don't know, epistemology, philosophy of language, that some principle of rationality, both theoretical and practical, are principle of charity in the Davidsonian sense, maximizing understanding, even not agreement, and also a fallibilist principle, which goes together with a sort of openness to experience, because we might be wrong. So if you talk to people who are arrogant, and those people might not perceive themselves as being arrogant, but we perceive them as being arrogant, and you ask them about those rational principles, the principle of charity, the principle of being fallible, they might say, so how self-apply those principles? Are there some psychological pieces of research done on that, or some philosophical speculation? So what make people who prima facie are rational not to perceive themselves as being trapped into that kind of epistemic error?
Yeah, that's a great question, difficult one to answer in this context briefly. But what I can say, I mean, obviously that's a central question, a very important question. It's, as you noted, an empirical question. What makes people in the psychological state that they don't recognize they're in, but others of us can recognize? I gave a sort of conceptual discussion of it, but there is a large body of empirical literature now on what's called intellectual humility and its opposite, arrogance. And that literature has, as empirical literatures do, some disagreements in the literature of people about this question they're asking. And some of that has to do with different empirical psychologists like Mark Leary at Duke, or David Dunning of the Dunning-Kruger effect, and Michigan and Cornell. Like these two particular psychologists, both preeminent, they both study these things. They have slightly different answers to your question because they have slightly different characterizations of what intellectual humility and arrogance are. And so, this is typical for psychological research, right? There's conceptual work that has to be done by people like ourselves sometimes to help tidy up the field in a way that we can see how people's answers are distinct and similar. But I think in the case of some of this research, what it seems to suggest is that people get into these states through, as I just suggested very briefly, causally, partly because of certain socially reinforced attitudes that human beings are often in. about their own mental states. First, there's a fear of being perceived as ignorant. So nobody likes to be wrong, and nobody wants to be perceived as being wrong and making mistakes, because you don't get promoted generally, unless you're Donald Trump, by making mistakes, right? Generally speaking, you're socially reinforced to fear a mistake. You're also socially reinforced to be perceived as confident, as knowing the answers. We socially are rewarded for taking the stance that we know what we're talking about. That fear, coupled with the desire to, both of which are socially reinforced, is, according to work done by some of the psychologists I mentioned, and including by a scientific group that involves philosopher Alessandro Tanazzini in Cardiff, these folks tend to think that these are the prime causal factors. I hope that explains. There's a lot to be said there, and I hope this was responding to your question.
Yeah, I agree very much with what you said. So unfortunately, we are not living in a sort of Socratic world.
Yes,
for sure.
No, we're not.
As much as we wanted as philosophers to live in a sort of Socratic. Thank you.
Yes, I agree.
Thanks so much for the question and for the answer. And this has been quite a privilege. Thank you so much, Michael. And please join me in thanking Professor Lynch once again.
Thanks so much. I very much appreciate the questions. Thank you.